Nobody in that sunlit hospital corridor expected the ward nurse to answer back. But when the surgeon's fiancé told her to fetch coffee and disappear, one quiet sentence from Margaret Ellison changed everything that happened next. The Hargrove family wing of Calverton Medical Center had always been a place of particular pressure. The wing bore the name because the Hargroves had funded its renovation 11 years ago, a fact that Diane Hargrove mentioned approximately as often as she breathed. She did not work at the hospital. She had never worked anywhere, as far as anyone could tell, but she moved through those corridors as though the plaques on the walls were personal thank you notes addressed directly to her. Margaret Ellison had been a registered nurse for 22 years. She had held the hands of people dying without family. She had talked to teenagers through the worst nights of their lives. She had memorized the names of her patients' children, their allergies, their fears. She had done all of this quietly, professionally, and with the kind of steadiness that the nursing staff called backbone, and the administrators called indispensable. She had also, for 14 months, watched Diane Hargrove treat the hospital's caregivers like furniture. The afternoon it finally changed had started like any other. Margaret was completing medication rounds on the 4th floor, when she heard the elevator open and the particular rhythm of heels that had learned to announce themselves. She did not turn around immediately. She finished documenting the dosage in her patient's chart, capped her pen, and only then looked toward the corridor. Diane Hargrove walked like a woman who had never been asked to wait. She wore a linen blazer the color of cream, her dark hair pulled into a knot so precise, it looked architectural. Her engagement ring caught the fluorescent light as she lifted her phone to check something, then let her arm fall with visible boredom. Behind her, 2 women in similar clothes moved in careful attendance. Not quite friends. More like an audience she had curated. Dr. Nathan Hargrove was somewhere in the building. He always was. He performed cardiac surgeries with the kind of focused brilliance that made younger residents nervous and grateful in equal measure. He was also the man who had once stopped in the middle of a hallway to ask Margaret if her mother had recovered from her hip surgery, because he remembered she had mentioned it 2 weeks before in passing. He was not the problem. He had never been the problem. Diane stopped near the nurse's station. She looked at the desk with the expression of someone who had found a mild inconvenience blocking their path. A young aide named Sophie was logging intake records. She was 23, still in her first year, and she had the misfortune of being the only person within reach. "Can you find out where Nathan is?" Diane said. It was not a question. Sophie looked up. Her hands stopped on the keyboard. "He should be finishing his consult," Sophie said carefully. "I can leave a message at the desk for him, or you could try his." "I did not ask for options," Diane said. "I asked you to find him." Sophie's face changed in the way young people's faces change when they realize the person in front of them is not going to be reasonable. She nodded and reached for the phone. Margaret had already moved closer, not rushing, just close enough. "And while you are at it," Diane continued, her eyes moving past Sophie as though Sophie had already ceased to be relevant, "I will need coffee. The dark roast they keep for the attending physicians, not the one from the machine in the lounge." Sophie's hand paused on the phone. "I can show you where the family waiting area is. They have." Diane looked at her fully for the first time. "That is not what I asked for either." The 2 women standing behind Diane exchanged a look that managed to be both apologetic and entertained. Margaret set her medication tray on the counter. The sound was quiet, but it was enough. Diane turned. Margaret looked at her without hurry, without performance. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away in the moment while taking everything in for later. She was not tall, not imposing in the traditional sense. She wore her navy scrubs and her badge clipped straight as she always wore it, and her hair was pulled back the way it always was at this hour. "Sophie is on the nurse's line," Margaret said. "I am going to ask you to wait until she finishes." Diane blinked, then a small and entirely controlled smile appeared on her face. The kind of smile people wear when they want you to know they have decided not to be angry, and that their decision is its own kind of punishment. "And you are Margaret Ellison, charge nurse, 4th floor." Diane turned fully now, squaring herself the way she had likely done in many rooms over many years when a situation needed to be resized to match her expectations. "Well, Margaret," she said, and the way she said the name compressed it, flattened it slightly, turned it into something smaller than a name. "I have been coming to this hospital for 3 years. I think we both know the coffee situation. The medication rounds can't be interrupted," Margaret said. "And Sophie is completing intake documentation that affects patient care this afternoon." Diane's smile did not waver. "Perhaps you could help me instead then, since you are the charge nurse." It was a pivot, polite on the surface and designed to be unanswerable without appearing obstructionist. Margaret recognized it the way you recognize a road you have traveled before. "My rounds are also patient care," Margaret said simply. Diane's eyes moved down Margaret's scrubs and back up. The look took less than 2 seconds and communicated a great deal. "You know," she said, "I am going to be part of this hospital's future in a significant way. Nathan and I are getting married in 4 months." She paused to let the weight of that settle. "It would really benefit everyone here to make a better impression." The corridor had gone the particular quiet that Margaret associated with rooms where people had decided not to speak. There were 3 other staff members visible. A dietary aide near the elevator, a second nurse charting at the far end of the station, a resident who had appeared from a patient's room and then stopped moving when he registered the atmosphere. They did not speak, they did not look away. Sophie put down the phone with a soft click. She had not completed the call. Margaret kept her eyes on Diane Hargrove. "I am sorry," Margaret said. "This is not the way to speak to my staff." Diane's expression didn't change quickly enough to hide the flash of something underneath. She controlled it, covered it, rearranged her face into a patient and slightly saddened look that Margaret suspected had practiced itself in mirrors. "I was not being rude," Diane said. "I was making a simple request." "You told Sophie she was not giving you what you asked for," Margaret said, twice, in the tone you would use with someone who does not understand basic instruction. "She is 23 years old and she is on her first cardiology rotation. She understands basic instruction very well." Diane laughed. It was a short sound, not real. One of the women behind her looked at her shoes. "I think you are overreacting," Diane said, "and I think Nathan is going to want to hear about this." Margaret looked at her steadily. "That is your right." Something shifted in Diane's expression. She had been expecting a retreat. People usually retreated. They apologized, adjusted, smoothed the surface. The ones who did not retreat usually raised their voices, and raised voices could be reported and punished and used as evidence of unreasonableness. But Margaret had not raised her voice. She had not stepped back. She had simply continued to be where she was, saying what she meant, and that calmness was somehow more destabilizing than anything louder would have been. "My name will be on this wing someday too," Diane said. It was quieter now, stripped of the warmth she'd been performing. Not a threat, something worse, a statement of certainty. Margaret looked at the plaques on the wall, the ones that bore the Hargrove name in raised bronze lettering. Then she looked back at Diane. "Those names belong to the people who put patients first," Margaret said. The corridor absorbed the sentence. Diane took one breath, then another. Her hands moved to her bag strap, adjusted it, settled. "You will regret this," and she turned and walked back toward the elevator. The 2 women fell into step behind her. One of them glanced back at Margaret. Her face was complicated. The elevator doors closed. The dietary aide near the far wall exhaled. Sophie looked at Margaret with an expression that was part relief and partly terror. She said quietly, "She is going to tell Dr. Hargrove." Margaret picked up her medication tray. "Yes," she said, "probably." She continued her rounds. Nathan Hargrove found her 40 minutes later. He came to the 4th floor nurse's station in his surgical coat, still carrying the blue cap he wore in the OR. He looked like a man who had been moving fast, and had slowed himself down deliberately before arriving. Margaret was completing discharge notes, and she did not look up until she finished the line she was writing. She looked up. Nathan's face was difficult to read. He had always been like that in the hospital. He kept the same expression through difficult surgeries and difficult conversations, not because he was cold but because he had learned, the way good doctors learn, that a readable face cost patients something. He said, "Diane called me." Margaret waited. He put the surgical cap on the counter. "I would like to hear what happened," he said. That surprised her slightly. She had expected something else first. A quieter version of what Diane had been saying maybe, a diplomatic framing, an apology in advance of the details instead he had asked to hear. She told him what had happened. She kept it simple and sequential the way she documented things. She did not editorialize. She told him Sophie had been on the nurse's line. She told him Diane had asked Sophie to interrupt it. She told him what was said about the coffee, and she told him what she had said in return. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This has happened before," he said. It was not quite a question. Margaret held his gaze. "Yes." He rubbed one hand across his jaw. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. "She said you threatened her," he said. Margaret's expression did not change. "I told her that was not the way to speak to my staff." Nathan nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "And the staff here," he said. "Have they said anything to you before today?" The question opened something. Margaret had not expected it to. She looked at the desk, at the notes she had been writing, at the names of the patients she knew by heart. She thought of the dietary aide who had once told her in the break room that he dreaded Diane's visits. The resident who had started taking the stairs to avoid the elevator when Diane was in the building. The young aide from last spring who had submitted a transfer request 2 weeks after being spoken to the way Diane had spoken to Sophie today. "Several Margaret said. "Yes." Nathan's face tightened. "I did not report them formally," Margaret said. "I should have." She said it plainly. Not as a flagellation, not as an apology. As a fact she had decided to acknowledge. Nathan picked up the surgical cap and turned it once in his hands. "Why not?" he asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. Margaret considered the honest answer. "Because you were not here when they happened," she said. "And the people it happened to needed the work, and I was not certain anyone would believe that a situation serious enough to report was happening quietly in corridors." The word quietly landed. Nathan looked at the hallway beyond the station. He was looking at something Margaret could not see. Or perhaps at something he was only now allowing himself to see. "She has done this the whole time," he said. Margaret said nothing. She did not need to confirm what he had already arrived at. Nathan set the surgical cap down. "I need you to stay on the floor," he said. "I am going to have a conversation." He walked toward the stairwell at the end of the corridor. Margaret turned back to her discharge notes. But her pen did not move for a moment. It rested on the page while she thought about something her mother had said to her once. A long time ago in a small kitchen in Bakersfield. With the window open and the sound of the neighbor's radio coming through. Her mother had worked laundry at a hotel for 31 years. She had pressed the same linens for the same rooms and been thanked approximately never. Her mother had told her, "There will be people in your life who call themselves important. You will know the real ones by whether they ask you how you are. The ones who only tell you what you are worth to them, those are the ones you walk away from still standing up." Margaret had been 12 years old. She had not fully understood it at the time. She understood it now. The thing about Calverton Medical Center that most people did not appreciate was that silence traveled fast in it. Not sound, silence. The particular absence of noise that meant something had shifted. Staff who had worked there long enough developed a sense for it, the way you develop a sense for weather when you spend enough time outdoors. By 4 in the afternoon the fourth floor knew. By 4:30 the floor below it knew too. No one said anything dramatic. No one announced anything. It moved in glances and in the careful way people positioned themselves near doorways and in the particular attention they gave to their ordinary tasks while their ears stayed elsewhere. Margaret heard it later, in pieces. From Sophie, who had been in the family consultation room with a patient's daughter, when Diane's voice came through the glass. Not clearly enough to make out words but clearly enough to understand the shape of them. From the resident who had been in the next room and had written a single line in his notepad, that said "I am documenting this," and underlined it twice. From Harold Finch, the hospital's head of operations, who was 71 years old, and had been managing administrative crises since, before most of the staff had been licensed. And who appeared at the nurse's station at 5 minutes to 5 with his reading glasses pushed up on his head, and told Margaret in a very low voice that he needed to speak with her in the morning. She did not ask why. She suspected she already knew. What she did not expect was what Sophie told her when they were alone at the end of the shift. Sophie had been restocking supply drawers, which was the kind of task she did when she needed to think. She closed the second drawer and turned around and said without preamble, "I looked something up this afternoon." Margaret looked at her. "There is a trust," Sophie said, "under the hospital's charitable giving records. Public filing. Set up 8 years ago by the Hargrove family." She paused. The original trustees were Thomas Hargrove and someone named Ellison. Margaret went very still. Sophie looked at her carefully. "It is a common name," she said. "It might not be anything." Margaret's hand moved to the supply counter. She pressed 2 fingers to the edge of it, not for balance. For something to hold that was solid and real. "My father's name was James Ellison," she said. Sophie said nothing. "He died when I was 19, Margaret continued. "He had worked in hospital administration, not here. At St. Anselm's across the city. He died very suddenly. There was no will that we ever saw. He had told my mother he had set some things aside, for the future. But nothing came through." She paused. "We assumed the paperwork had not been completed." Sophie reached into her coat pocket and set a folded printout on the counter. Margaret looked at it. She did not touch it yet. The name James Ellison was visible in the second line. She had come to Calverton 8 years ago, the same year the trust had been established. She had applied for the position because the pay was better and the commute was shorter, and because a colleague had told her the cardiac unit was extraordinary. She had not looked for anything. She had not been looking for anything. She had simply needed a job and this hospital had offered her one. Her mother had said something when she told her she'd accepted the position. Something Margaret had understood at the time as ordinary maternal worry. She had said, "That name is a big name in that building. Be careful around big names. They have long memories and short consciences." Margaret had laughed. She had been 36 and she had thought her mother was being dramatic. She picked up the printout. Nathan Hargrove found her in the same place he had found her before. He came back to the 4th floor at 6:15 when the shift handoff was nearly complete. He looked different than he had 4 hours ago. Less careful. More like a man who had arrived somewhere difficult and decided to sit down in it rather than keep moving. He stopped at the nurse's station. "Margaret," he said, "can we go somewhere quiet?" It was not a question but it was not a command either. There was something in it she recognized, the specific register of a person who has learned something they cannot unknow. They went to the consultation room at the end of the hall, the family room, the staff called it, the room with the box of tissues on the table and the chairs that were softer than the hospital's standard issue. And the window that looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted something, trying to be a garden. Nathan closed the door. He sat across from her but not behind the table. The same choice Charles Whitmore had made in the library, placing himself without a barrier. Margaret noticed it the same way Grace would have noticed it, as a choice that meant something. She told me tonight, Nathan said, that she has known about the trust for 2 years. Margaret's breath stopped. Diane, he said. She found the public records before we were engaged. She knew your father's name was on the founding documents. She knew what the trust was meant to do. What was it meant to do? Margaret asked. Nathan looked at her steadily. My grandfather established it with your father because they worked together to build this hospital's charitable giving structure. Your father contributed intellectual labor and initial planning and was promised a proportional stake in the trust's eventual disbursements. When he died, that stake should have transferred to your family. Nathan stopped. It never did. The courtyard outside the window was dimming in the early evening light. Someone had planted marigolds. They were very orange against the gray stone. Why? Margaret asked. Nathan rubbed his face with both hands. Because my grandfather chose not to notify your family. He told himself your father had not completed the formal paperwork. He told himself it was cleaner. He told the trust's attorney it was a cleaner outcome. The word cleaner. He used it twice in the documentation. Nathan's voice had gone flat. I found the correspondence this afternoon. Harold had it in the administrative archive. Margaret looked at the table. Nathan continued. Diane knew this. She knew your name when she arrived here 3 years ago. She knew why you were here, even if you did not. Margaret looked up sharply. She believed, Nathan said, and his voice carried a particular quality on that word, believed. The quality of a man repeating something he cannot accept but must report accurately. She believed that if you ever found out, you would have a legal claim against the trust. She believed the simplest solution was to make sure you left the hospital before that could happen. She had been trying in her way, for 14 months. The dietary requests you complained about, Margaret said slowly, the referrals she sent to HR. Nathan nodded. There were 4 of them. Margaret had known about one. The room was very quiet. Margaret thought about the young aide who had transferred. She thought about the resident who took the stairs. She thought about Sophie at the nurse's station with her hand frozen on the phone, 23 years old, and already learning the cost of being in the way of someone powerful. She had not been the only target. She had simply been the intended one. Nathan, she said, why are you telling me this? He looked at her the way people look at questions they have been asking themselves for several hours. Because you did not have to say anything today, he said. You could have let Sophie manage it. You could have stayed out of it. You had every reason to protect yourself and you chose to protect your staff instead. He stopped. And because I looked at you in that corridor 4 hours ago and I thought, this woman has been carrying something in this building for longer than she should have had to carry it alone. Margaret's eyes filled. She did not let them go further. She had long practice. There are people, she said, who think silence is safety. She thought of Sophie, she thought of the dietary aide, she thought of her own 14 months. I kept thinking that if I just did my job well enough, if I was indispensable enough, nothing could take it from me. Nathan was quiet. Margaret pressed her hands flat on the table. My mother cleaned rooms for 31 years. She ironed other people's sheets and folded their towels and no one learned her name. She told me once that the hardest part was not the work. The hardest part was that the work was invisible. She looked at Nathan. I became a nurse so the work would not be invisible so BC should see it and know it mattered. Nathan said, it matters. The sentence was simple. She did not dismiss it. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the printout Sophie had given her. She placed it on the table between them. Nathan looked at it. He did not touch it. I did not come here knowing this, she said. I came because I needed a job and this hospital was a good hospital. Nathan nodded. But my father helped build something here, she said, and no one told us. And someone spent 3 years trying to make sure we never found out. The marigolds outside were almost invisible now. The courtyard had gone dark. Nathan stood and walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. I called my family attorney from the parking structure at 5 o'clock. I told him everything. He is going to begin a review of the trust's disbursement history and your father's original contribution documentation. Margaret was still. Harold is pulling the correspondence from the archive, Nathan continued. He has agreed to make a full statement. Margaret looked at the printout on the table. Nathan turned back to her. There is more, he said. Margaret waited. The engagement is over, he said. I told Diane tonight before I came back up here. Margaret looked at him. She did not perform surprise. She was not sure she felt it. Nathan, she said. That was not the purpose of any of this. I know, he said. He sat down again. I had been watching something in her that I told myself was stress, and adjusting to the hospital culture, and the particular difficulty of being engaged to someone who works the hours I work. He stopped. But that is not what it was. I understand that now. Margaret thought about the word now. About all the places that word sat in a life. About how much had to fall away before certain things could be seen clearly. She thought about her father. A man she remembered as careful and precise, who had loved paperwork in the way accountants sometimes did. Not for its own sake, but because he understood that documentation was the only way to make invisible things last. He had kept carbon copies of everything. His desk at home had been a filing system that her mother had never fully understood, and had not had the heart to dismantle after he died. She thought about the months after his death. The attorney who had reviewed his papers and found nothing formalized. Her mother's face across a kitchen table in Bakersfield, saying, "He told me it was set up, Margaret. He told me we didn't have to worry. He had not been careless, he had been deceived." She folded the printout and held it in both hands. "I want to finish my shift," she said. Nathan looked at her. "I have discharge paperwork for 2 patients," she said, "and the medication reconciliation for the overnight team." She smoothed the printout once with her thumb. "And then I would like to go home and call my mother." Nathan nodded slowly. Margaret stood. She pushed the chair in. She stopped at the door. "For what it is worth," she said. "You asked me what happened before you told me what Diane said." She paused. "Most people lead with what they have already heard." Nathan said nothing. There was nothing to say to that which would add to it. Margaret opened the door. The 4th floor was quieter now. The shift change done, the evening settling into the slower rhythm that hospitals took on after 6. The lights in the corridor were a little dimmer at this hour. The sounds were different. The charge nurse from the overnight team was already at the station, young and efficient and reliable in the way overnight nurses had to be. Margaret Ellison walked back to her desk. Sophie was still there, technically off the clock, restocking a 3rd drawer that did not need restocking. She looked up. Margaret sat down and uncapped her pen. "Go home," Margaret said. "You did your job well today." Sophie hesitated. "What is going to happen?" she asked. Margaret looked at the discharge paperwork. "The truth usually takes longer than it should," she said. "But it tends to arrive." She began to write. Outside the window at the end of the hall, the marigolds in the courtyard were invisible now against the dark. But they were there. They had been there all along, planted by someone whose name nobody had recorded, growing in the in-between spaces of a building dedicated to the idea that invisible things still matter. Margaret Ellison wrote her patient's name at the top of the page. She wrote it clearly, the way she always did. First name, then last name, then date. She made sure the letters were legible. She had learned early and relearned often that the smallest acts of care are sometimes the ones that last the longest, and that a person does not have to be famous or powerful or remembered in bronze to leave something real behind. Her father had known that. Now she did too.